Welcome to the third and final day of our Global DEI conference. We are so excited today to be uniting under the banner of conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, brought to you by Ludo and One Business World. We are diving into crucial dialogue to help form workplaces that are more equitable and inclusive. I'm now joined by the brilliant Meggie Palmer, who is the founder of Pep Talk Her. Meggie, welcome, and over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me. I'm so excited to be talking about all things leadership today through a different lens, through the lens of imposter syndrome. So let's jump on into it. Let me give you some quick background. Very aligned with Elizabeth and the work that she's doing at Ludo. My name is Meggie Palmer, and I run a company called Pep Talk Her, which is focused on closing the gender pay and leadership gap. I spent a long time, 15 years in my career as a foreign correspondent for the BBC World, for CNBC, traveling all around the world telling stories. And at one point in my career, I found out that the journalists who identified as male sitting in the newsrooms next to me were actually getting paid significantly more. I thought it was a mistake. I had a conversation about it, and my employer at the time said, if you don't like it, you can quit or take us to court. And so that was my introduction to the inequality that, as we know, exists in many facets in the workplace. And so I really set out on a mission to try and change that. So we launched an app that helps you track your successes at work. So it's totally free. It's part of our impact work. And yeah, it's kind of, we like to say to people, it's like a Fitbit, but it's for your career. So instead of tracking your steps at work, it'll track your work wins. So this is one technique actually that we suggest for our clients to use in terms of overcoming imposter syndrome, which is what we're going to talk about today. So let me know in the chat if any of these identify with experiences that you've had. The feeling that I was just lucky, I'm not that smart, I'm a bit of a fraud. If anything of this resonates with you, let me know in the chat, because chances are, if you've had these experiences or if you've had these thought bubbles popping up at work, you're likely experiencing something that's called imposter syndrome, right? And when we look at the technical definition of what it is, it's a psychological phenomenon where actually we're unable to internalize and own our achievements. Even though those achievements and those successes might be objective and rooted in fact, our brain doesn't let us acknowledge that actually we are okay to sort of acknowledge that and to own it. So it's a feeling where you might experience feeling like a fraud or like you're unqualified for work that you're doing already, right? I remember when I was a journalist and I got a big promotion, I had this sense that I would be found out at any moment, that folks would realize that they'd made a mistake in hiring me and that the imposter police would come and drag me out of my office at some point. The good news is, if you've experienced this, you're in very good company, right? There's some very famous folks who have openly spoken about their experiences with imposter syndrome, including Michelle Obama when she was in the White House, Tom Hanks, Emma Watson, and Tom Hanks likens it to being like a tightrope, right? That we're all walking. Even Maya Angelou, the super successful author, says that every time she published a book, even after all of her success, she would still wonder if they'd be finding her out, right? And so when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, the victories that we have and the success that we have actually diminishes in importance in our mind, right? Whereas the failures loom large and seem hugely significant. So objectively, the failures and successes that we have in the workplace should really, in large part, be considered with an equal weighting, right? But what happens when we're feeling like an imposter is those failures loom large and they sort of take all of our energy, and we can end up spiraling in a really big way, right? So the root cause of imposter syndrome actually goes all the way back to childhood, right? So what happens is, as kids, we grow up and we see all these adults doing all these things that we can't do as little children. And we think that they've all got it figured out, that they're sort of like holier than thou, that adults have everything together, right? And we're not able to see that actually there's more going on, right? Because you and I understand what's going on in our world, in our situation, and in our life. But we only see from others what they choose to project into the world, right? And so this has only become worse with social media, because now we're getting a very curated view of what people's lives are really like, right? But in fact, if we unpacked the onion, unrolled some of those layers of the onion, and if people were truly honest, we would understand that even folks who are hugely successful, per some of the examples we talked about earlier, even they have stuff going on, right, that we don't know about, that causes them to doubt themselves as well. But we don't see that in other people. We assume that what's going on above the surface is the full picture. But in fact, there are challenges that all of us are facing, right, in life. And so one of the things that's a really helpful exercise to do is to reflect on, like, how is imposter syndrome impacting you right now? Like, how is it showing up for you in the workplace right now? So feel free to let me know in the chat, what's one word that sums up how imposter syndrome shows up for you? So an example might be stuck, or it can show up through procrastination. It might show up as failure in the workplace. There's all sorts of different ways that it can show up. It can make you sort of feel fearful of the success that you're otherwise having at work. And it can actually lead to you holding yourself back from your full potential and from the success that you could otherwise be having in the workplace, right? So if we think about, let me know if you have any questions, by the way, in the chat. I would love to we can make this as interactive as possible. Happy to take any questions as we're going through as well. So one of the other things that's really helpful when we think about imposter syndrome, more than half of the population experiences it. And, it's actually not all women. There is a bit of a perception that it's only women that experience imposter syndrome, but it's actually not, right? It is disproportionately female identifying folks experiencing imposter syndrome, but men as well, as we saw from the example earlier with Tom Hanks, also experience some of these feelings. So if we're feeling like an imposter, we sort of need to acknowledge that for what it is. And we need to come up with some strategies and tactics to move through that, right? Because we don't want to be wallowing and spiraling in that for a long time. And so one of the things that we always talk about at Pep Talk Her when we think about imposter syndrome and overcoming it from a structural perspective is, I love an acronym. So we like to use the acronym of ART, right? That overcoming imposter syndrome is an art. And when I say that, what I mean is acknowledge. We're going to be acknowledging, we're going to be replacing those negative patterns, and we're going to be tracking those successes, right? So it's actually acknowledging that this is what I'm feeling like. And sometimes when you have the language to understand that, oh, I'm not weird, I'm not unusual, I'm not the only one that feels like this. Actually, I'm one of millions of people around the world going through something that's called imposter syndrome. That can be really powerful. So we want to acknowledge those feelings that come up. We actually want to make a conscious choice to say, no, thank you, reflect it away, and then we want to move forward, right? So the ART framework, acknowledging, replacing, and then tracking those successes to keep them front of mind. Because when it comes to imposter syndrome, really, a lot of what we're doing is neuroplasticity work. So we're actually trying to rewire pathways in our brain that are no longer serving us, right? So we want to start to strengthen new neural pathways that are going to build us up, that are going to say to ourselves, it's actually okay for me to acknowledge this success and to own this success. And we're going to start to de-strengthen some of those patterns that have been hardwired, probably from childhood, towards new patterns that are going to better serve us, right? So if we can label those feelings as imposter syndrome in the first place, that's actually the first step, so that then we have a framework to understand what we're going through, and then to think about how we can move forward from there. And the biggest thing that helps with shifting our mindset around this is replacing that negativity and those, fake news facts that are not rooted in reality, that are not rooted in facts, and actually replacing them with positivity, right? And positive facts that are backed up, which we're going to talk about in a second. And as I said, one of the reasons that we worked with a behavioral psychologist at Pep Talk Her to build the Pep Talker app was for this exact reason. Like, it really is rooted in the idea of the nudge theory and trying to shift our mindset. So if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, I wish I could tell you that after this webinar, it'll all be fixed and gone and done. And sadly, that's not the case, right? Because we are creatures of habits. And as humans, we need a long time to create new behaviors. And so the Pep Talker app was really built as like one tool to help create a new behavior when we think about ourselves, when we think about overcoming imposter syndrome, and when we think about the potential for ourselves and our career, right? Tracking those successes is one of the steps in overcoming imposter syndrome. And it's a big reason why we built the app, because what it does, as I was saying, it's sort of similar to like a Fitbit. So it's going to send you a notification. It's going to be like, Elizabeth, what's up? What are you really proud of this week? And she might put in there, we ran a great global DEI conference. You might work in sales. So you might be like, I signed a new client for $50,000. Maybe you manage a team and you got some great feedback from one of your staff. So you could screenshot that feedback, upload it into the app, and then that's all in the one place, such that when you have a performance review, when you go in to have a pay raise negotiation, you have data to put meat on the bone around those conversations. So instead of just walking in there and saying, I would like a pay rise, please, you're walking in there saying, here's some of the amazing things that I've achieved this year. I love working for this company. And for these reasons, I would love to talk to you about my compensation moving forward. Because you have more confidence, because you have the nuts and bolts, right? You have the numbers, you have the metrics, you have the examples of the things that you've done at work this year, right? You're regularly reflecting. I don't know about you all, but I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast on Tuesday, let alone in March. Say nothing of July or August, right? Because there's a lot that's happening and our brains can't contain all of that knowledge. And so a big part of the Pep Talker app is to kind of get it out of your brain into the app so that you can then use that to overcome imposter syndrome and also to further your career, right? And that's a free resource that we do as part of our impact work. So it really is, the Pep Talker app is one tool in a toolkit to overcoming imposter syndrome, right? But it starts with you and your mindset, right? And I always say to people, it's like, if you're trying to shift a behavior, particularly when it pertains to your success at work, if I wanted to get massive biceps, I would have to go to the gym and do this with some weights every day for a long time. If I do it once for a week, nothing's really going to happen. If I do it once for a week, for a month, okay, might feel a bit of, stress in the muscles. They start to get stronger. But if I do this once a week for a year, for 2 years, 3 years, all of a sudden this muscle is like massive, like Arnold Schwarzenegger style, right? Because I've been focusing on it. I've been flexing it. I've been exercising it regularly. And it's the same thing when it comes to our mindset. So when we are feeling negative about work, when we're feeling like we're not good enough, when we're feeling like we're a fraud, we need to do a couple of things, right? Going back to that ART framework, we need to acknowledge it. And then we need to replace those negative patterns and track the success to make sure that the positives are staying front of mind. So replacing the negative patterns is easier said than done. So one of the things that you can do is surround yourself with folks who are going to give you really positive feedback. Honest feedback, but also hopefully some positive feedback. You can also actively seek out positive feedback, because if you've had a bad day at work, like, you are not work, you are not a product of your work, you are separate from your professional life, but it can be hard to remember that. And so, another exercise that you can do is, if you're feeling like you're in a bit of a spiral in terms of imposter syndrome, in terms of your leadership qualities, reach out to someone. I love this phone a friend exercise. You can just text a mate and just say, hey, I'm doing this seminar and they've asked me to text someone who I know and ask you this one question, like, what would you say is my best quality? If you're having a bad day at work, if you're walking into a job interview or a performance review and you're not feeling 10 out of 10, text someone. It can be your mom, your sister, your cousin, your work BFF. I don't care who it is. And blame it on me if you like. Say you're at one of my seminars if you feel awkward, and just ask them. And you can do this exercise now if you like send that text. And just say, hey, what would you say is my best quality? Because you'd be really surprised at some of the messages that folks get back. We speak to, 50, 60, 70,000 people a year around the world with the workshops and speaking that we do every year. And, some of the texts that people receive bring folks to tears, because we don't know how other people see us, and we don't always appreciate the impact that we have on others' lives. So there's a couple of lessons here, including all of us could maybe do a better job of telling people the impact they have on us. But when you need that affirmation externally, don't be afraid to ask for it, because that's going to help strengthen those neural pathways too. Because when we're getting that positive feedback from folks who love, trust, and respect us, that's like another exercise of like strengthening that pathway in our mind to be like, I am good enough. I do have really good qualities. I am calm in chaos. That's right. I do always have really great ideas. I am really kind to new folks at the organization. You're creating a new narrative and you're rewiring that old one, right? So coming back to the framework of acknowledging it, replacing it with more positive thought patterns, whether that's through tracking your successes in the app, whether that's through surrounding yourself with supportive people, sending those texts proactively, all of these things are going to ladder up to make a really big difference for you. The other thing that's really valuable when you're looking to replace those negative patterns, some of you might have seen Amy Cuddy's TED Talk. She's done a great TED Talk, which we can link to in the notes as well, on power posing. So one of the things that we know about perception and confidence in the workplace is that actually when you have more testosterone in your body, you are perceived by others as more confident, right? And one of the simplest ways to increase the testosterone in your body, from Amy Cuddy's research, is to make yourself big. So if I was going into a job interview, I have the option to kind of ahead of time, or a tough conversation at work, I could sort of be scrolling on my phone, see how I'm quite small, versus I could stand up, and be sort of like ahead of the big conversation, making myself as big as possible. And actually what that does is it shifts the composition of our body in that moment, right? It actually increases the amount of testosterone that we have. And so when you are feeling like an imposter, perhaps, presenting to the executive or going into a really large meeting, having a really hard conversation in the workplace, use all of these tools to your advantage, right? Like make yourself big, go into the bathroom, do some power posing, whatever it takes, so that you can get those incremental shifts in how you show up, and also importantly, how others perceive you. Because as I say, when we have that increased testosterone in our body, the way that other people perceive us shifts as well, right? All of this is to say that all of this work around imposter syndrome and understanding our value in the workplace, really, it's an internal game first. I wish I could tell you there was a pill that you can take. And it's kind of, you got to do the work. And it's one of those things, those books when you're a kid and it's like, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you got to go through it. For better or worse, it makes a huge difference though, right? And the fact that you're here today, I just want to pay tribute to you all, because you're investing in yourself and your professional development. And that says so much about you, right? And I want you to take the time, not just to focus on your professional development for how you can help others in the organization, but I would love for you to reflect on how can you focus on yourself? It's not selfish to want to grow yourself, because actually when you can spend that time doing the internal work on yourself, you can show up in a better way for your team, for your leadership, for your executive, and indeed for your family and friends as well, right? So that self-talk is so powerful. And I wish that they taught us that at school instead of algebra and history and all of those other things as well, right? The other thing I'll say before we open it up for questions today is that, there is a choice. Anytime at work, when you're feeling like things are out of your control, when things are spiraling, I just would love you to sort of remember this conversation that we've had today and just take a moment to reflect, to be like, actually, you have a choice at work. It can feel like things are out of control, and there's so much at work that we cannot control. We cannot control the economy. We cannot control if and when COVID comes back. We can't control interest rates. Maybe you can in your job, but I can't, right? We can't control that. And so what we can control, though, is how we future-proof our business from a revenue perspective, how we train our team, how we structure our team so that we can, scale up and scale down depending on the economy. Those are things that we can control. We can control how often we choose to have courageous conversations at work. You can control who you share this video with today. If there's other folks in the organization who you can see are experiencing imposter syndrome. The reason that I even knew about the concept of imposter syndrome is back when I was a journalist. One of my old bosses took me aside one day and he's like, hey, what's going on? I'd got a big promotion to a big new show as a correspondent, whatever. And I was in this room of 8 other very impressive correspondents. And we were doing this, the new show, brainstorming, whatever. And I was just like, I just could not, I couldn't believe I belonged. I didn't think that I belonged in the room. I couldn't believe I was there. I didn't think that I belonged in the room. And that was clearly emanating to other people, such that the boss who'd hired me noticed. He said, hey, should we get a coffee? I said, yeah. And he goes, hey, what's going on? I was like, no, nothing. This is great. Thinking I was faking it till I made it, And he's like, no, what's going on? I can see that you're not in a good place. And he's like, I think what you're experiencing is imposter syndrome. And at that point, I'd never heard of it. And he actually shared with me his story. He's like, he is still a very senior media executive. And he said, I still, to this day, at the time, I guess he was mid-40s, maybe early 50s. He's like, I still feel like every day the imposter police may knock on my door and sort of drag me out by my feet. And in him sharing that story, it really gave me permission to understand that, firstly, that was the language that I needed to understand that I was experiencing imposter syndrome. And he also gave me permission to not feel weird about it and to know that I wasn't the only one, right? It's not just the celebrities who are experiencing these too. Chances are it's your boss, your best friend, maybe your colleagues, perhaps one of your executives, right? And so actually in sharing your story in the workplace with someone else, If you identify behaviors in them that are maybe similar to some of the things that we talked about today, perhaps you'll even hear some of the language. I'm not that smart, or it wasn't even a big deal, I closed that project, like, you know, anyone could have done it. If you're getting a sense of any of these experiences or feelings from folks in your team, like, pay it forward. Do what my boss did to me and take them aside. Let them know that they're not the only one. Perhaps if you've experienced it, you'd like to share your story. Or perhaps you can share some of the tips that you've learned today, you know, maybe around the framework of the acknowledging, replacing, and tracking those successes, so that you have that data, so that when those unhelpful thoughts come up, you can replace them with a more positive one. So yeah, I would just like to encourage all of you today to, like, pay this forward. You know, you are leaders in your own organization, and I would love to see you paying this forward to someone else. Because actually, when we can all show up as our full self in the workplace and step into that full capacity and confidence that we inherently have, it's just buried a little bit sometimes. When we can do that, you know, the capacity to make huge change in the workplace is significantly increased. So I wanted to leave space for questions, and I want to appreciate all of you for showing up today. And I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, so definitely say hi. But Elizabeth, holler if we've got any questions. I'm excited to hear who we've got in the room.
Thank you so much, Meggie. That was so brilliant. Because we have people in so many different time zones, we've got some people in the room, but also people that will see this on playback, which is great. But I had a couple of bits I wanted to pick up that really resonated for me.
Sure.
So imposter syndrome, going back to childhood, in all my conversations in imposter syndrome, I've never really got into the root of where it comes from. So I think that's really helpful for us all to realize. Right. And as a mother, actually gives me a really interesting lens for my children. You can see it like that way, which was great to hear.
Yeah, great.
And I love how you call it fake news, this stuff we give.
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing. And then I just wanted to share a quick moment, actually, of you talking about power posing, you know, and standing. So yesterday we had the in-person part of our DEI conference in London, where I ran a panel. And before I stepped into the room, I really did that. You know, I just did exactly that. And I was like, right, stand up straight, root down, be really present. And I'm naturally a fast talker, as you can tell, but I find that helps me just slow down, be present, which helps, I think, a lot of that dialogue we can have in our minds.
Well, it's funny, and I think you're quite right. It's you know how even sometimes like people say, if you're feeling anxious, if you're having a panic attack, take 3 deep breaths, which just seems like the most outrageous advice, because it's like, yeah, I know how to breathe. I do it all day without thinking about it. But also when you do that, when you stop and you do 3 deep breaths, that intentionality is game changing. You know, it's funny. Like, it's just like, it's the simplest thing. It's not rocket science by any stretch, but it's actually so powerful. And it's the same thing with the power posing. It's like intentionally taking 5 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes to just like step into your power. It is a physical thing, you know, and I always say, if you are not feeling confident, if you're like me, you've had a baby up all night, and you got to do a big presentation, you're like, oh, where am I going to find the energy? I just am not going to be showing up as my full self today. The other trick that I have is like steal someone else's. So like channel your inner Oprah, or channel your inner Wiggles. If you if you've got kids who like the Wiggles, which is like this kids music. Anyway, channel someone else's energy, their enthusiasm, and borrow that. It's like you sort of like put on. And you might not be feeling 10 out of 10, but you know what? Oprah always shows up, and it certainly seems to me like she's 10 out of 10. So borrow that. And even for that process of like, I'm going to show up like Oprah today, like strength, warmth, confidence, inclusion. Yeah. Even that is like another 5% shift, 1% here, 1% there. And then all of a sudden you're 10, 20, 30% feeling better than otherwise. And that all adds up, and it's cumulative, you know, and it is a habit to your point. So yeah. Amazing. Meggie, thank you so much. It's been a total pleasure to have you today. Have a beautiful day. Thank you. We'll speak to you soon. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Bye.